Hello again. So this week we'll be reading chapter 17 through 19 of I'm Malala. As always, if you haven't pulled up the quiz, pull up the quiz and follow along because I will stop at each question as we go. We'll go ahead and get started. After 3 months of living here and there with strangers and relatives, we were finally on our way home. As we drove down the mountain pass and saw the Swat River, my father began to weep. When we saw the condition of poor Mingora, we were all in tears. So question number 1. Why was the whole family in tears? Why was the whole family in tears? Everywhere we looked, we saw buildings and rubble, piles of wreckage, burned out cars, and smashed out windows. Storefronts had their heavy metal shutters pried off. Their windows were gaping, their shelves were empty. It seemed that every building was pockmarked with bullet holes. It still felt like a war zone. Army soldiers peered down at us from machine gun nests on the rooftops, their guns trained on the streets. And even though the government had said it was safe to go back, most people were still afraid to return. The bus station, normally bustling with the chaos of brightly colored buses and hundreds of travelers, was deserted, and weeds were growing up through the cracks in the paving. But there was no sign of the Taliban. As we rounded the corner to our home, we prepared ourselves for the worst. We had heard that the houses surrounding ours had been looted. TVs and jewelry had been stolen. We had held our breath as our father unlocked the gate. The first thing we saw was that the garden in front of the house had become a jungle. My brothers immediately ran off to check on their pet chickens. They came back crying. All that was left was a pile of feather and bones. Their birds had starved to death. Meanwhile, I ran to the guest room where I had hidden my books. They were safe and sound. I said a prayer of thanks and paged through them. How lovely to see my quadratic equations, my social studies notes, and my English grammar book again. I nearly wept for joy until I remembered. We still did not know whether our school had survived. Someone has been here, my father said as we entered the school gate. The building across the street had been hit by a missile, but miraculously the school was still intact. Inside, cigarette butts and food wrappers littered the floors. The chairs and desks were turned upside down in a jumble. The Cushall School sign was in the corner where my father had placed it for safekeeping. I lifted it up and screamed. Underneath were a handful of goats' heads. It took me a minute to realize they were the remains of someone's dinner. Anti-Taliban slogans were scribbled all over the walls, and inside the classroom, bullet casings littered the floors. Army Zindabad, which means Long Live the Army, was scrawled on a whiteboard. We understood then who'd been staying there. The soldiers had punched a hole in one of the walls on the upper floor, through which you could see the street below. Perhaps they had used this spot as a sniper's post. Although it was a mess, our beloved school was still standing. After surveying the damage to the classrooms, my father and I went into his office. There he found a letter the army had left for him. It blamed the people of Swat for allowing the Taliban to take control of our homeland. We have lost so many of the precious lives of our soldiers, and this is due to your negligence, the letter said. Long live the Pakistani army. My father shrugged. How typical, he said. First the people of Swat fall under the spell of the Taliban. Then they are killed by the Taliban, and now they are blamed for the Taliban. It was all confusing. I used to want to become a doctor, but after everything we had been through, I began to think that becoming a political leader might be a better choice. Our country had so many problems. Maybe someday I could help solve them. So question number 2. Malala said in earlier chapters she wanted to be a doctor. What is she thinking she would grow up and become now? So what does Malala want to be now instead of a doctor? Chapter 18. A humble request and a strange peace. Swat was finally at peace. The army remained, but the shops reopened. Women walked freely in the markets, and I beat Malka Enor for first place. I felt so hopeful about the future of my valley that I planted a mango seed outside our house. Question 3. What does Malala do now that she has hope? What does Malala do now that she has, or to show she has hope? I knew how long it would take a long time for the seed to bear fruit, like the reconciliation and rebuilding the government had promised, but it was my way of saying I was full of hope for a long and peaceful future in Mingora. Before we go on, what does the word rebel mean? So, for this one, you can use Google and pick the best definition out of those 4. We'll keep going. One of my biggest worries in those days was that around the time I turned 13, I stopped growing. Whereas before I was one of the tallest girls in my class, now I was among the smallest. So I had a humble request. Every night I prayed to Allah to make me taller. Then I measured myself on a bedroom wall with a ruler and pencil, and every morning I would stand against it to check to see if I had grown. I even promised that if I could grow just a bit tinier, or a bit taller, even an inch, I would offer 100 rocket nafil, extra prayers, on top of my daily ones. Question number 5. What did Malala pray for every night? What did Malala pray for every night? I was speaking at so many events, but I felt that my height got in the way of me being authoritative. I was so short that sometimes it was hard to get people's attention. In early 2010, our school was invited to take part in the District Child Assembly SWAT, which had been set up by the charity UNICEF and the Paul Core, My Home Foundation for Orphans. 60 students from all over SWAT had been chosen as members. They were mostly boys, but 11 girls from my school participated. And when we held an election for speaker, I won. It was strange to stand on a stage and have people address me as Madam Speaker, but I took the responsibility very seriously. The assembly met almost every month for a year, and we passed 9 resolutions. We called for an end to child labor. We asked for help to send disabled and street children to school. We demanded that all the schools that had been destroyed by the Taliban be rebuilt. Once again, the resolutions were agreed upon. They were sent to the officials, and some were even acted on. We were being heard. We were making a difference, and it felt good. So question 6. What did Malala feel good about? Why did she feel so good about it? So for this one, you're going to need to use complete sentences. It'll be 1 to 2 sentences, depending on how you phrase it. So you could say, Malala felt good about blank because, or Malala felt good about blank, and you can say she felt good about this because, and answer. So either one of those two, but make sure you're using complete sentences, proper grammar, good punctuation, good capitalization, all that stuff. Once you answer that, we'll keep going. By fall, clouds had gathered. A friend of my father's, a man who had spoken out against the Taliban, was ambushed on his way home. Then another man, a politician who had been critical of the Taliban, was killed by a suicide bomber. The summer of 2010 brought torrential rains, a monsoon that flooded the valley, sweeping away everything in its wake. Throughout Pakistan, more than 2,000 people drowned. Millions lost their homes, and 7,000 schools were destroyed. Our home was on a bit of a rise, so we were safe from the flooding, but our school on the banks of the river was hit hard. When the waters receded, there were chest-high watermarks. Our desks and chairs were covered with thick, foul-smelling mud. Repairs would be very costly. The damage in Shangla was even worse, and fundamentalist religious leaders suggested that, once again, God had sent a natural disaster as punishment for enjoying un-Islamic behaviors. So question 7. What happened that made the people think God was punishing them for un-Islamic behaviors? So what happened? What natural disaster occurred? So remember, they had the earthquake first, but what do they have now that caused problems and made people think that God was punishing them? So answer that and we'll keep going. By early 2011, the Taliban had blown up 2 more schools. They kidnapped 3 foreign aid workers and murdered them, and another friend of my father's, a university president who'd been outspoken against the Taliban, was killed by 2 gunmen who burst into his office. In May of that year, Osama bin Laden, the mastermind behind the 9/11 attacks, was killed in his hiding place in Abbottabad, just a stone's throw away from our military academy. So question number 8. In what month was Osama bin Laden killed? It was close to their military academy. So what month? Then an anonymous letter addressed to my father came to our house. You are the son of a religious cleric, it said, but you are like a convert. You are not a good Muslim. You have spoken out against us and you will face the consequences. The Mujahideen will find you wherever you go on the surface of the earth. It was starting to seem as if the Taliban had never really left. Alright. Question 9. What did Malala's father receive? What did Malala's father receive? I tried to tell myself this terrible letter was just the futile and parting shot of a defeated Taliban. But still I prayed for my father's safety every day. I prayed for my school to remain open and for the bombed-out schools to be rebuilt. I also continued to ask God to make me taller. If I was going to become a politician and work for my country, I told God I would have to at least be able to see over the podium. Question 10. What does the word futile mean? So again, you can use Google and find the definition in these 4 words that most closely matches the definition of futile. Chapter 19. Good news at last. One day in October 2011, my father called me over to show me an email he had received. I could scarcely believe what it said. I had been nominated for the International Peace Prize of Kids' Rights, a children's advocacy group based in Amsterdam. My name had been put forward by Archbishop Desmond Tutu from South Africa, one of my father's greatest heroes because of his fight against apartheid. Question 11. What award was Malala nominated for? What award was she nominated for? Then another email arrived. I was invited to speak at a conference on education in Lahore. The chief minister there was starting a new network of schools. All the children would receive laptop computers. He was awarding cash prizes to children all over his province who did well in their exams. And to my surprise, he was also giving me an award for my campaign for girls' rights. I wore my favorite pink shalwar kameez to the event and decided I would tell everyone about how my friends and I in the girls' high school had defied the Taliban edict and continued going to school secretly. I wanted children everywhere to appreciate their education. So I said I now knew firsthand the suffering of millions of children who are deprived of an education. But I told the audience, the girls of SWAT were and are not afraid of anyone. Question 12. What did Malala want children everywhere to know? What did she want all the children to know? I had been home barely a week when one of my friends burst into class one day and announced that I'd won another prize. The government had awarded me Pakistan's first National Peace Prize. I couldn't believe it. So many journalists descended on our school that day that it was a madhouse. So what prize did Malala win? What's the second prize that she won? I still hadn't grown an inch by the date of the award ceremony, but I was determined to be seen as authoritative nonetheless. When the Prime Minister presented me with the award, I presented him with a list of demands, including a request that he rebuild the schools destroyed by Fazlullah and that the government establish a girls' university in Swat. That sealed my determination to become a politician, so I could take action and not just ask for help from others. When it was announced that the prize would be awarded annually and be named the Malala Prize in my honor, I noticed a frown on my father's face. In our country's tradition, we don't honor people in this way while they are alive, only after they have died. He was a bit superstitious and thought it was a bad omen. Question 14, the last question. What did Malala's father believe was a bad omen? So what did he believe was a bad omen? So that's the end of your test. So you can submit that, and while you submit that, we'll finish up the book real quick, or this chapter real quick. My brothers, of course, kept me humble. They still fought with me and teased me and wrestled with me for the TV remote. I may have been getting attention from around the world, but I was still the same old Malala to them. I wondered, though, how my friends would take all this publicity. We were a very competitive group, after all, and of course there was always Maniva's feelings to consider. I worried that she'd think I'd abandoned her during my travels, or that she'd taken up with a new best friend. But there was no time to think about this on my first day back to school. When I arrived, there was a group of journalists waiting to interview me. When I entered the room, I saw all my school friends gathered round a cake, shouting, "Surprise!" They had taken up a collection and bought a white cake with chocolate icing that read, "Success Forever." My dear friends, they were as generous as could be and only wanted to share my success. I knew in my heart that any one of us could have achieved what I had. I was lucky that I had parents who encouraged me despite the fear we all felt. "Now you can get back to your schoolwork," Madam Miriam said as we finished our cake. "Exams in March." So that is the end of that part, actually, part 3. So like I said, if you haven't already, submit the quiz, and that's all we have for today. Bye.